It is officially 1923 on the standard time period, so we're going to begin our celebration of the 100-year anniversary of the Ellensburg Rodeo. My name is Daniel Beard. Welcome on behalf of the Ellensburg Rodeo Hall of Fame to the first night of the speaker series. Thank you so much for being here. We honestly did not know what to plan for, so standing room only. Please make that as comfortable as we can. Thank you for being here. I had kind of a fear that Mike and I might be the only ones sitting here, and I'd sit for Mike for 30 minutes. But very glad you guys all showed up. And, I know I personally am looking forward to tonight and then the whole speaker series. But learning about tonight as the subject, the beginning, the 1923, the beginning of the Ellensburg Rodeo. And looking forward to what Mike has to present to us. I'm going to present just a couple introductions of what our intentions are. On the 23rd of each month, running up to August, so up to August 23rd, we will have a speaker night. We will have one or two speakers in here to kind of be a keynote, a headliner, to introduce the topic and begin presenting various aspects of the Ellensburg Rodeo. We do mean it for it to be interactive, though. So if you have stories, family members, stories in your family history that you remember about the beginnings of the rodeo or the Native Americans or the concerts or the various topics, we do encourage you guys to bring those stories up. Myself or Joel, when Mike is done, we'll be walking around with the mic. We'd love to hear your stories and record those and put those in the Hall of Fame archive and preserve those stories in whatever way we can. I really do think the behind the scenes, the work that the Rodeo Board has put into 100 years, there's been blood, sweat, and tears poured into the event and the community for all this time. So it's a whole lot of work, a whole lot of stress, a whole lot of sleepless nights going into this, but it's also the biggest party our town has had for 100 years. So, thank you for everybody for your work in doing that and keeping that going. I also want to introduce, we've got the two young ladies who are the Queen royalty candidates for this year, for the 100-year. Alexis is back there. Yep, just waved at Alexis. And Ava is over here. Yep. So welcome, board member, professor, rodeo historian, magician, okay. Mike Allen. Okay, Mike Allen.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Wow. The couple of board members are worried about the seating situation. I said, don't worry, after I get started, we'll start losing a few folks. Start kind of dropping as the minutes go on. Well, I'm Mike Allen, and we're going to talk about rodeo tonight. Joe Powell once said to me that I got a professor hat and a cowboy hat, and that I wear, and I'm going to try to wear both hats tonight, and try not to overthink this. My dad used to tell me that I kind of was overthinking stuff, and that's what college professors do. They take really cool topics and things that are really interesting, and then they think about them too much and they ruin them. And so I'm going to try not to do that tonight, but let's talk about rodeo. And as I look around this room, I see a lot of folks that know a heck of a lot more about rodeo than I do. So let's go, and I'll be really interested to see what kind of comments we get as the open mic part of the program opens up. Well, rodeo. What is it? Rodeo comes from the Spanish word rodeo, and the Spanish verb rodear means to encircle or to round up, which is our connection here. Rodear, to encircle, to round up, which gets us to round us. We're going to get to in a couple of minutes here, but that's where the language comes from. And we know it's a sport, But it's a very unique sport, really. There's no sport like rodeo. First of all, it's not a team sport. And true, there's sports that are not team sports, they're individual, but it's not a team sport. I was going to say there's no pension system in professional rodeo is another difference between that and professional sports. But it's a sport, but it's unique. It's also a performance, and you'll often hear people involved on the rodeo board that talk about the performance of the afternoon or the show. And yet, I don't think we think of cowboys and cowgirls as performers, or entertainers. There are entertainers within the rodeo, specialty acts and that sort of thing, and that fits show and performance, but doesn't quite fit there, but it certainly is a component here. Is rodeo a festival? Heck yeah. And especially when you throw in the food and the drink and the parades and dancing and music and other elements that we identify with folk festivals, rodeo is definitely, and the county fair, rodeo is definitely a festival. Is it a reenactment? No one thinks of it as that, but as you sit there in the stands, you're watching cowboys and cowgirls reenact skills that were essential in the 19th century on the cattle frontier. They know those skills. They are historic skills, but they demonstrate them for us again in the rodeo arena. So in a sense, it is a reenactment. Is it a circus? And people always go, no, it's not a circus. Well, no, it's not a circus, but there are clowns. There are specialty acts, trick ride. There's a grand entry to begin the rodeo. That kind of, there used to be a brass band in the rodeo, which we identify with circus. So yeah, there are elements of circus within rodeos. But so it's all of those things. But certainly it's a sport. But it's a sport with a historic connection, and that's what really separates. Rodeo is connected to our history. It's the only sport I can think of, and maybe you'll think of something else as the evening goes on. But it's the only sport I can think of that has a direct tie to America's historic past and the skills that are demonstrated in the arena. And that's why it's so compelling. And you pay your money and you go into the arena and you watch the past unfold, or you watch skills of the past unfold before you. And so I don't think I defined rodeo, did I? Okay, well, I'll keep working on that. What is rodeo? Well, it's a folk festival that's connected to our past. Where does it come from? I'm going to talk about 4 basic elements tonight, and I'll try to go through them pretty quickly. But they are Wild West shows. Enchaleada, which is a Mexican folk festival, equestrian event. Powwows, Indian powwows. And then finally, roundups and ranch rodeos is where we'll finish up. And so I'm going to go through those 4, and then we'll talk about the Ellensburg Rodeo and the birth of the rodeo, and try to wrap it up there. Wild West shows. Wild West shows did not precede rodeo or come after rodeo. Wild West shows happened at the same time as rodeo was happening. And this was in the late 19th century, and this is really important for a lot of things that I'm going to be talking about tonight. The late 19th century was the time that gave birth to the rodeo, but it was also a time of the Industrial Revolution, or the peak or crescendo of the Industrial Revolution. And those two don't seem to go together, a agricultural, ranch-related event and a modern Industrial Revolution. But in fact, they do go together, because it was that time that people began to look to the past and began to see that things were changing, and they wanted to continue those connections. And this is where Buffalo Bill Cody comes in. Buffalo Bill Cody was a real guy. I mean, he was a historic character. He was a frontiersman. He rode in the Pony Express. He was a Civil War veteran. He fought in the Plains Indian Wars and won the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was a buffalo hunter. He did all that stuff. And then he figured out how to make a living as an older man portraying what he had done as a younger man. And he spent 20 or 30 years of his life going around portraying himself in a show. And incidentally, Davy Crockett had done this in the 1820s and 1830s. He's the first one who figured out how to tap into his folk hero image, and Cody did this, and he created something called the Wild West, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And that was his Wild West show. And it had elements of what we identify as rodeo, but it had a lot of other stuff too. It resembled a circus in many ways. It traveled the country, it traveled the world really. He performed before Queen Victoria. There were shooting contests, there was music and bands, there were foot races. In the Wild West, a supposed buffalo hunting demonstration. Annie Oakley was in the Wild West, the sharpshooter, so there were shooting contests. He reenacted Custer's Last Stand, and he played Custer in Custer's Last Stand. That was kind of the finale. And incidentally, the Wild West, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, it was never called a Wild West show. It was called the Wild West. So you bought your ticket and then you went to the Wild West. You didn't go to a show, which is kind of interesting. But Annie Oakley was in the Wild West, and there was a grand processional parade, a grand entry like there is in a circus, and there was elk riding. He rode. Some people rode on the back of elks. There were Indians who accompanied Cody and worked for Cody, who were northern Lakota Indians who had fought in the Battle of the Little Big Horn and were in this Wild West show. So how incongruous the what was going on there, and people loved it. They flocked to this thing and loved watching it. And an important part of it was something he called Cowboys Fun. It was in the program as the Cowboys Fun, and it was bucking broncs and steer roping. And so there were those elements of rodeo in the Wild West show. As I was going through all of those different parts of the Wild West show, you recognized a couple of things. There was trick riding, trick roping, that sort of thing, that show up in the rodeo, and certainly these cowboy events do. And but there were no bulls. Or steer wrestling, or wild cow milking, or anything like that. But that was Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And incidentally, Doc Fenning, and we've got some displays on a lot of things I'm going to be talking about tonight. Doc Fenning, who was the first president of the rodeo, he was a big Wild West show fan. And he kind of was thinking of a Wild West show when he created the 1923 rodeo, or helped to create the 1923 rodeo. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Charreada, which is a Mexican equestrian event. Has anybody seen this before on television? If you cruise deep cable and go on the Spanish language channels and kind of skip through over the weekend, you'll see people, charros, Mexican cowboys, and cowgirls on horseback, costumed, competing in events, roping, competing in these contests, and especially in the Southwest, Arizona, California, that part of the world. This was an important influence that eventually showed up in rodeo. It started in the 1600s. One of the things that interested me about Charreada is they have these mounted drill posses that are costumed and do drills, and boy, that sounds a little vaguely familiar, you know. If you go to the Big Island of Hawaii and go to rodeos there, sometimes you will see elements, because there's a Spanish influence there, you'll see elements of Charreada. One more thing about Charreada, they've got a bull. I won't call it bulldogging, but like the charro, the cowboy, the vaquero, follows the bull out of the chutes and runs it down. But then instead of bulldogging, grabs it by the tail and does a maneuver, a flip that's somewhat similar to in steer roping, you know, catching the flank like that and knocking it over, and knocks the bull over like that. Yeah, and there's so deep cable. Okay, I'm telling you. You never know what you're going to run into. Another event in Charreada is a rider on his own horse, then chasing a wild horse and mounting the horse bareback on a run like that. And so there's some connections here. Fancy roping, trick roping is very important in Charreada, and we've had specialty acts here in the arena that I'm sure have worked in Charreada in California. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about powwows, and powwows they were called potlatch. On the coast there was a different name, but powwows as we know them over here emerge in the late 19th century, and they're really a result of the reservation system when American Indians were forced onto reservations. They wanted to retain elements of their culture. They also wanted to travel and not remain stationary, which was part of their way of life. And so they began to stage powwows, which were simply modern versions of gatherings and meetings that had taken place throughout their culture, in which there was dancing and feasting and gambling and horse racing. So feasting, gambling, horse racing, dancing. They wanted to retain these elements of their culture, and so the powwows began to emerge. And when rodeo came along, rodeo could fit into that pattern. And so what I just went through, dancing, feasting, horse racing, think of the rodeo and elements of the rodeo, and especially the rodeo when we had the track here, and you see that's all part of the rodeo too. And so this moves me then to roundups, cattle roundups, and of course those were roundups are for work, and we know about a lot of this today. Roundups are for work. There's work to be done, but there's also some fun that can be involved, and competitive elements after the work is done. And in the 19th century, in the cattle roundups, then they castrated the cattle, they doctored the cattle, and did the work that they had to do, and then the cowboys competed against each other. And they rode bucking broncs. The cowboy fun then, and this term cowboy fun shows up in the 19th century. These events that they enjoyed at the roundups, after the roundups, they began to attract attention, and people from town began to go out to the roundups, and the roundups slowly evolved into what were called Sunday rodeos. And so they didn't even always do it at roundup time. They began to have these Sunday rodeos regularly at ranches, and as we'll see, Ellensburg is one of the places where those took place. And so slowly these roundups and the activities, more and more people began to go see them. And of course somebody in town came up with the bright idea, and this was happening. Somebody thought, if we could get this into town, a bunch of people would come, and they would pay money, and they would stay in hotels, and this could become. And remember, again, Industrial Revolution, modernity, the old agricultural way of life is still there. It still is, but it's going away, and people have to have other ways to make a living, and agricultural communities have to have other ways to make a living. And maybe if you had a rodeo, then that could become an economic force in the community. Good idea, huh? Yeah. And so this leads in the late 19th century to all of these forces come together, and they lead to the creation of rodeo. And don't ask me where the first rodeo was, and you'll run into people, they say, oh, well, our town had the first rodeo, if they're from Deer Trail, Colorado, or if they're from Cheyenne, Wyoming, or if they're from Pecos, Texas, and I'm talking 1870s and 1880s. If they're from Prescott, Arizona, they had the first rodeo in Prescott, Arizona. Oh no, Miles City did. It was Miles City, and this is what folklore and folk festivals are like. It's real difficult to identify who did something first and who was first, because this is going on everywhere simultaneously. And so Deer Trail, Colorado, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Pecos, Texas, Prescott, Arizona, Miles City, Montana, Cheyenne, Wyoming, the granddaddy of them all, right? Well, I don't know, Cheyenne's 1897 and Deer Trail, Colorado is 1869, so maybe Deer Trail's the granddaddy of them all. But there is no first rodeo. I guess really it'd be whoever charged admission was the first one. And so we don't know for sure. But rodeo emerged in this part of the country, Pendleton Roundup, 1911, Calgary Stampede, and then Ellensburg, which is really a second generation rodeo. These rodeos I just described, they're really what I would call first generation rodeos, late 19th century, and then another generation comes along. I'm gonna read to you a little bit here. This is a book that I wrote in 1998 about rodeo, and it's not about the Ellensburg Rodeo. It's just about rodeo in general in North America. And I published it with University of Nevada Press and dedicated it to my dad. And this has a few pages on the Ellensburg Rodeo because I used it as a case study. There was no way I was going to do this without getting Ellensburg in, with a good chunk. And so this is what I wrote at that time about the Ellensburg Rodeo. Ellensburg was first settled following the Civil War. And lay in the heart of a thriving cattle region. Thousands of cattle and horses grazed the rich meadows and semi-arid plains of the Kittitas Valley. And the roundups and Sunday rodeos that characterized cattle country were very common among the Kittitas cowboys. So too were the impromptu competitions and cowboy fun that had emerged elsewhere. By the early 1920s, cowboys on at least 2 Kittitas Valley ranches were staging regular contests, or as the locals called them, Sunday rodeos. Now we've got a couple of exhibits here, behind you, the Ellensburg Rodeo story, and then where Daniel is right there, where we're focusing on this particular topic for the centennial. Ben Ferguson, a local cowhand and rodeo competitor, described his family's promotion of one such event. We had all them horses, and my brother and a couple of friends put on a rodeo, Ferguson remembered. My brother, he just wanted to have some fun, just got a neighbor boy or two here, went out, rounded up them cattle and horses. They got a wagon load of poles and made a corral and made the arena and the chutes. And that's the end of the quote. During the early 1920s, the Ferguson staged rodeos, he said, every other Sunday. And it was not unusual for 100 to 300 spectators to attend. The plot thickens. The economic potential of all this activity did not go unnoticed. Ferguson remembered that several townspeople saw that we was having a big time, as he said, and began to discuss the possibility of staging a rodeo in the Ellensburg city limits. Sometime around 1922, a group of townspeople came to ask the Ferguson brothers to assist them in staging the Ellensburg Rodeo, and they asked many others as well. They come out here and got us to go in there and furnish the horses and the stock, and then they began to organize the rodeo. 4 groups came together to create the Ellensburg Rodeo, and I'm going to go through them one at a time here. First of all, ranchers and cowboys, like the Fergusons. We're talking about a lot of different families here, but a lot of it goes northeast. A lot of it is the northeast part of the valley here. And in many ways, this lesson, this talk, is my county road talk, because these names I'm going to be rattling off here. You go, oh, yeah, this is Cook, Thomas, Ferguson, Morrison, Gage, McEwen. I list those because in 1998, when the Hall of Fame began the family inductions, John Ludka said, we need to do these families first. And then, of course, there were subsequent families which followed. But these are ranchers and cowboys who were very important in creating the rodeo. Secondly, farmers. As opposed to ranchers, and I know there's an overlap, okay, but is it the musical Oklahoma? The farmer and the cowman can be friends, they say. And there was that divide here in the 19th century, and so the farmers are another element because they got the county fair, and they've had the county fair for decades. That's a 19th century festival, and they're thinking, well, if we can combine the county fair with a rodeo, we're really going to have something going here. And I'll mention just one name here, although there are many others, but Leonard Davis was the county extension agent, and he was really the push on the county fair side of creating the rodeo. Next, you've got the business people and professionals in town. These are not farmers or ranchers, although they probably have some kind of an agricultural background. They probably grew up on farms or ranchers and know that. But I'm talking about like Doc Finning, who was a veterinarian, had a lot of rural connections, but was a professional in town. He was the first president of the rodeo. Cliff Kaner, the editor of the Daily Record. Clarence Fitter, Lee Scott, and some of these names. Phil Adams, who was the state representative and hustled a little state money for the Ellensburg Rodeo because they came up with about $10,000 between the county and the state of Washington. Well, finally, there's Indian people, and especially Yakima. But in the first decades of the Ellensburg Rodeo, the Spokane Indians, Colville Confederated, Wenatchee, coastal Indians came to the Ellensburg Rodeo, and they still do to some degree. But Yakima nation certainly was the heart of this, and their families like and Kittitas Band and Wanapum Band of the Yakima, and so names that Nason, So Happy, One Penny, Totus, Buck. These are very important families that were part of that group, and so it all comes together, and nobody. I mean, how did this happen? It was just chemistry. And it all came together. And they had about $10,000, and they bought some land with that money, but he didn't have nearly enough money to finish the grounds. In an important move, the Kittitas County Fair Board called upon Valley residents to donate materials and labor for the construction of the rodeo grounds. They set aside Thursday, June 14th, 1923 as a field day for building the new arena. And of course, this is our creation story, and you'll see, I've got a few photographs of it right here. There are some in that display. But the field day was a one-day event. People worked on the grounds all summer. They worked actually 3 days that weekend. But the field day that's the crescendo, and that's when 500 people I mean, how many of you know this story? How many times have we heard this story and told this story? This is our creation story. And so communal work projects like the field day are a important part of the Western tradition. We think of Westerners, wild Westerners, as rugged individualists, but in fact, when they wanted to, they worked together. Quilting bees, barn raisings, these kinds of events. And so Howard Thomas remembered, I was riding for Cook's Ranch. I said, can you spare me a few days to work on the rodeo? Mr. Cook said, I can give you a week. So I brought 4 horses, plows, and a spring-tooth harrow and a scraper. I drove them into town. When it was light enough to see, I was going to the grounds. When it was too dark to see, I was going back to his camp. He camped over by what we now know today as the Thunderbird Motel. Kept his team over there and fed them. And then went to the oh, did I say today the Thunderbird Motel? Well, let me tell you this. I'm quoting from the Ellensburg Daily Record. Let me tell you what they accomplished that weekend. They graded a road, a racetrack, and the arena, rerouted the creek around the site. Gee, I wonder if the EPA was there to supervise that. They built corrals, fences, 3 bridges, and a grandstand, plumbed new water mains, dug ditches, pruned trees. Their accomplishments were amazing. As the Ellensburg Evening Records headline shouted, community effort is successful. Businessmen, farmers work on fairgrounds, side of toilers, working in common, inspiring. The rodeo was ready to go. Well, over the rest of the summer then, they got everything organized. And this was not a Labor Day weekend rodeo. It was a September 13, 14, 15 rodeo. Doc Fenning was the president or the superintendent of the rodeo, as he was called. And many locals who we fortunately have their oral histories at the public library remembered the first rodeo. Lillian Pope noted, you knew pretty much everybody that was riding in it. It really made a difference because it was really more of a local show. Another Kittitas Valley old-timer described the competitors as local ranch hands, real cowboys, competing in wild horse races, stagecoach races, and chariot races. And in addition to these events, there were grand entry parades, bucking broncs, calf roping, relay races, bulldogging, and special races for Indian contestants. The record noted, hundreds are in overflow crowd, grandstands filled, and most in attendance reported, and I'm quoting, they reportedly yelled and cheered and thoroughly enjoyed Ellensburg's first real rodeo. Well, in moving towards a conclusion here, it's interesting to speculate about their motives and what motivated them to create the Ellensburg Rodeo. And certainly they did it to celebrate their frontier lifestyle and to celebrate the rural heritage. But as I said, that was a heritage and a lifestyle that was beginning to go away in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And perhaps that's also a reason that they wanted to have a rodeo. I think that the desire to stage a rodeo was partially due to a pronounced nostalgia. A nostalgia felt by townspeople and valley residents for a pioneer and cattle ranching life that was being replaced slowly by their world of automobiles, airplanes, moving picture shows, and radio broadcasts. And each of those 4, automobiles, airplanes, moving picture shows, radio, that's all in the first decade, second decade, and third decade of the 20th century. That's all going on. And so they wanted to keep that. They wanted to preserve their heritage and their traditions. At the same time, a modern Chamber of Commerce type boosterism and promotion also characterized their motivations. Town business and professional men, women were in the forefront of the rodeo movement. They were joined by farmers and cattlemen and Yakima Indians, and they put on the rodeo. And of course, memories and folk traditions of their frontier lifestyle were still viable and alive, and they relied on their frontier folk heritage to create the rodeo. Volunteerism, the community spirit of the pioneer days, provided the base upon which the Ellensburg Rodeo was built. It was because of volunteers that on September the 13th, 1923, the first cowboy mounted a bucking bronc and the Ellensburg Rodeo was born. Thank you.
So as we move into kind of the interactive part of the procedures, we would definitely welcome stories, contributions. If you guys have, family memories of the early history of the Ellensburg Rodeo. Also, if you have questions that we could answer, Mike may not be prepared, but I'm going to put Mike on the spot for that. If there's information about the presentation you'd like follow-up questions, go ahead and let us know that also.
I'll ask Mike one.
Okay.
Mike, the first rodeo was in September 13th, is that what you said? When did it become a Labor Day weekend rodeo?
Yeah, it's 1930s. I forget the exact year, but Lutka's got a chapter in the 75-year history that says Labor Day is ours. And I think it's like chapter 3 or 4. And so Labor Day, it wasn't always Saturday, Sunday, and Labor Day. It was a September rodeo, and then Labor Day in the 1930s became the official weekend.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, I'll go here first and then over there.
When Mike was talking about the rodeo grounds being put together to begin with, it reminded me of my grandfather telling me that he came to town, and I don't remember what kind of stuff that he brought with him, but he came into town from the Badger Pocket, where he homesteaded, and helped work on that, and that was one of the most prideful things he had. And growing up with a dad that was highly involved with rodeo and posse rodeo board, when I was growing up, I didn't know anything else happened on Labor Day weekend. It was a real shock to me that other things happened in the world. And he was the parade director for many years, and we were banned from touching the telephone from March until after rodeo.
Thank you very much. Thanks for getting the story started.
I was just hoping that Mike would share with us his history of the Ellensburg Rodeo and the creation of Earhoff.
Earhoff, the Ellensburg Rodeo Hall of Fame, is a result of the 75th anniversary celebration. Remember that? 1997, can you believe it? The 75th anniversary of the Ellensburg Rodeo, the publication of John Lutke's book, The Tradition Lives, and the rodeo board was thinking about what to do for the 75th, just like they were thinking 2 or 3 years ago what to do for the 100th, and the Hall of Fame became part of that. And the other rodeos have halls of fame. We needed to have one, and so a group of people got together, the founding board members, and we had a big induction up at the college. We're all-star induction with Tom Ferguson and Dean Oliver, and Jim Shoulders was here, Monty Montana, and so that's how we kicked off the Ellensburg Rodeo Hall of Fame. But at that time we were thinking, you know, there's going to be a 100th anniversary someday, and we're going to have to get ready for that.
We were going through photos, and my grandma goes, well, this is Grandpa when he was helping. He brought his horse team every day in to help clear the ground for the rodeo, and he said it was just a community thing. It wasn't anything that anybody got paid for. It was like our top hands now, you know, people just work for the sake of helping the rodeo, and it was a pretty big deal. And it was, you know, it was also the Indians were there, and it was all a group deal. It wasn't like there was any animosity, and it was a pretty neat deal that the community got together and did that.
I'd like to hear a little bit about the Beard family and their involvement over the years.
Okay, well, my family's involvement would not have been in 1923.
Along the way.
Yeah. So my grandpa was born, let's see, I'm trying to put this in my head, in 29? I think so is when he was born. His family was actually picking fruit, almonds, etc. down in California at the time when he was born. So he didn't like to tell that to anybody. So you get family secrets right here. My grandpa was born in California. But then he competed in the rodeo circuit, but actually kind of more regional stuff. Like I'm not sure he ever competed at the Ellensburg Rodeo in his competition days. But he was more of the local, the more regional rodeos when he was competing and riding saddle broncs and barebacks and the wild horses and
Providing the stock?
that came much later.
Okay.
So his story became he shod horses as a living for his family, and it wasn't until his youngest boy got interested in riding saddle broncs that he kind of stumbled into being a stock contractor. And then, let's see again, thinking my way through this, they moved up to Ellensburg in 77, I think is when they moved into the valley. They lived in Sunnyside and Outlook before that. Yeah. Okay.
Mike had mentioned the roundups, and probably other than maybe the Fergusons and the group up the Northeast, my dad, Joe McManamy, started in the first Cattle Association. So it was Joe McManamy, Jim Hand, Bill Haberman, and Jack White. And we had the forest range north of here, up above Wilson Creek and Lion Rock. And we started having the cattle roundups in 1950. And as the years went on and through the rodeo, many of those that came to the roundup, it was a men only, incidentally, was the King County Sheriff's Posse. Probably 10 or 15 of those guys came every year. Pierce County, Yakima County, Wenatchee. It became another time to get together to tell stories. I can imagine what those would be. But they did get the cattle out of the hills, and it became a tradition that went on until 1989. So the roundups are kind of like rodeo. They took somebody to make that happen, all the volunteers that become involved. A lot of these early rodeos and up through the 60s, because of the roundup, we had the stock contract for the cows and calves. And now, I don't know where that comes from now, but I understand what it's like to be like the Beards. You had to mother those cows and those baby calves, and we didn't have all the fences that are around the rodeo then that they have now, and sometimes they'd be downtown if they wanted to go.
I'm Bill Woodworth, representing the King County Posse, still doing the grand entries for the rodeo. This year, this will be our 77th grand entry. The King County Posse was established back in 1941, and the first record of wasn't a rodeo, because back in 1943, 1944 during the war, there was no rodeo, but there was what they called a play day, and the Ellensburg Rodeo Posse put on a play day, and that's when the King County Posse came over and presented the colors for those two play days. Our first rodeo was actually in 1945 when we actually presented the colors, and we've been doing so for the past 77 years. And this was the first year that I was listening to Justin McKee up in the booth. And we always are waiting to go in. Mr. Lau always comes over and asks us if we're ready. I say, yeah, we're going in through those chutes, not on the runway. That's a joke we got. And anyway, we wait for the Yakima tribe to come down. We count them off the hill, because sometimes they don't all come out. And we want to make sure we go in and don't disturb whatever they're still doing. But anyway, we go in, and Justin McKee announced this year, he said, the first time I ever heard him, he said, here's our friends from the West, the King County Posse. And this is their 76th year of doing this. So I thought, wow, 76 years. Now, I've only been at it for 22 years. The tradition in the King County Posse was when we had a princess on the court, if your father rode a horse, he would join the King County Posse there after. Well, it just so happened that my daughter Megan, which you may know, Megan Meeks, up at the rodeo office, that was my daughter. 2001 was her year for being the King County Princess. So that's when I got introduced into the posse, and now I'm the captain. They've been the captain for 16 years. They obviously think I'm doing an okay job, so they don't want to vote me out. But no, we enjoy doing it. It's a real thrill to present to the color on our palominos and silver saddles, and the 4x6, and going around the arena and the crowd standing up. You're real close to them and they're taking your picture and just loving what you're doing. And it takes a special horse to stand out there and watch 300 people go around you like a barrel and try and stay on top. So, but we enjoyed doing it, and we'll be there again this year. Thank you.
You guys had a rodeo princess every year for till, I don't remember what years it. Yeah, so they'd have a princess, and then so I was embellishing on the 75th, which was in 97. They had you guys didn't have a princess that year for some reason, so they had an extra princess from Ellensburg. So they had 2 Ellensburg princesses, and they had another Ellensburg girl, and then the queen. So they had 3 princesses that year. But my daughter ran and got a princess deal. But anyway, so they actually had special outfits made that year. The fringe, like the kind of like Pendleton has or whatever, the full riding outfits. And they sent some of them to Japan for like several days. So it was quite an extra expensive deal. But they really celebrated quite a deal that year. But yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Mike, we really don't have a time in the speaker series to cover the topics, but I was just wondering real briefly if you had any thoughts or if you knew the history, like how did the Great Depression affect the Ellensburg Rodeo in those early years, or Prohibition? Which one was worse?
John doesn't talk about Prohibition. We keep coming back to John Ludka tonight, and rest in peace, but he really helped. He put it all together. You know, the Antlers Hotel burned down in 1967. That was the rodeo headquarters, and all the records burned up, and our history burned up. It was still scattered around the valley, but John's the one who put it back together again, and he put the statistics back together again. To answer your question, Daniel, that's a lot of history to go through. Interestingly, the rodeo went on during the Great Depression, and it continued to grow during the Great Depression. The Cowboys organized during the Great Depression and formed their association that eventually began the PRCA. But one of the things we talk about in the 100-year history is the World War II and the pandemic. And if you were kind of charting out the Ellensburg Rodeo, those would be 2 catastrophic events that actually had to cancel the rodeo, and we've lived through one of those. So that was a slapdash answer to your question.
Thank you.
Even though I'm supposed to be taking photography here, I do have a little history relative to why I'm here in Ellensburg. My grandfather moved his family in 1940 here, and one of the reasons he did was the Great Recession that was hitting Wisconsin. He was a dairy farmer out there and moved it here. But once my father loved this area, he said there's got to be a better way to make a living. So he did, after 20 years here, 1940 and 1960, became a pharmacist. But he kept coming back here for the Ellensburg Rodeo every year and brought us as kids. And I fell in love so much with the place about 18 years ago, moved my family here and had the kids then get involved in the fair and 4-H and leadership around here. So the rodeos played a huge part in the quality of life I think my kids have shown as a result of the heritage over time with my family.
We've received a lot of different kind of artifacts and histories with the 100-year celebration this year. Our job as the museum is to preserve basically the oral histories of people who were involved in the rodeo, the artifacts of people who were involved in the rodeo, and have the story available both in this room and through the digital media that the world works on now, that we can tell the story of the Ellensburg Rodeo for another 100 years. Thank you all for coming. Mingle, visit.